And good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Dorothy Abel this morning. This is a little bit of a different Grand Rounds speaking venue for us today. Dorothy comes to us with over 32 years as a regulator with the Food and Drug Administration. She did her original training and got her Bachelor of Science from the University of Iowa in biomedical engineering in 1986. She then got her
Tell them how old I am.
She then got her Master's of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. Currently, she serves as the Vice President for Regulatory Strategy at Syntactx in New York City, which is a global full-service CRO, or clinical research organization, specializing in complex interventional medical device and pharmaceutical trials. There, she oversees the development and execution of regulatory plans designed to help clients formulate their product development strategy and achieve market approval. As I said, she served in the FDA for 32 years. She was responsible for promoting and protecting the health of patients. She served in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, as an expert in vascular and endovascular prostheses. Most importantly, she was the lead reviewer for a number of first-of-a-kind, innovative, and complex device areas, such as transjugular intrahepatic stents, coronary artery bypass grafts, vascular grafts constructed of new materials, vascular access grafts intended for early access, endovascular grafts, pressure monitoring devices, and endostaplers. Her selected honors are that she has the CDRH Career Achievement Award in September 2020 for outstanding achievement in driving medical device innovation. In 2006, she received the FDA Civil Service Civil Engineer of the Year Award. She has over 50 publications, with 19 as first author, and over 100 invited lectures around the world. I've known Dorothy for over 15 years, and we had a very professional relationship with our investigational device exemption clinical trials, both here at Harborview and at UW-Montlake. And we've been able to achieve some outstanding things over the last decade. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dorothy Abel. Dorothy, welcome.
Thank you.
Everyone's clapping.
Hey guys, come on. Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate it. Are we good in terms of the volume?
There was a little feedback, so just maybe make sure that there's no other microphones in the room that are on.
So do you always do Zoom even when you have live? Or is this the first Zoom?
No,
Good now?
Innovation.
All right, well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I just I don't know what you did right in life to be able to come and do things like this and talk to folks like you, because you're gods and I'm just a little regulator. So I appreciate the opportunity, again, just to start the conversation talking about pre-market studies, because there's a lot of things that people don't understand with respect to what FDA does and what those studies mean. I've never had to do disclosures before. My entire professional career before I was at the Sea Galley restaurant has been at FDA. So we could never, we had to take a vow of poverty, could never own any stock or whatever. And so when I got prepared to do this, I said nothing to disclose. And then they rightly told me, oh, you do work for someone and your clients pay you. And so it's just a little bit interesting. A lot of new things for me. I've never done a presentation with a mask on. No, it's all good. I think it makes me younger. But I don't have anything to disclose with respect to promoting therapies that aren't approved by FDA. So you've all seen the objectives of what I was hoping to talk to you about today, but really trying to understand and embrace the differences in regulatory and clinical perspectives is what we're working on today. I pretty much feel like the substitute teacher for orchestra in coming here to talk to you because I'm not a surgeon. So what do you do when you're a substitute and you don't play an instrument? Well, you show a movie. So Ben, if you could cue up the movie, no, never mind. But I really did think that we could talk about West Side Story, because it's a movie that my daughter had to watch in orchestra when she had a substitute. And it's just a great example of where when there are problems with communication, like with the Jets and the Sharks, you end up making bad decisions. And you can come up with less than optimal outcomes. Now, I don't think that the gap between regulatory and clinical is that extreme that we're going to end up in a rumble, but I certainly think we need to acknowledge differences to make sure that we avoid unnecessary bloodshed. You get it? Bloodshed? So as I said, I'm not a surgeon, so I just want to take a little bit of time to explain who I am and what my experience has been and how I kind of got here. So when I started at FDA, I had the biomedical engineering degree, so I knew a little bit about some of the clinical speak, but not very much. So I went to as many meetings as I possibly could go to and started with cardiothoracic, just because that's where my colleagues were going. So I just had to hear over and over again some of the lingo, so I could understand not just the language, but the perspectives, and certainly the unmet need of the patients, because you have to think about balancing when you're doing regulation of devices. You need to do the right level of regulation. If there are patients out there that there's a major unmet need, obviously you need to kind of back off a little bit, not have quite as much control, get some options out there. So that's how I started to connect with the surgical world. And once the vascular societies started presenting more on medical devices, I started going to those meetings. And that's where I got to be friends with people like Nitin and Matt Sweet and Ben. And so really focused on collaborating with the clinicians to try to do this regulatory thing right, because otherwise it's I don't want to say, not mafia, not Gestapo. Anyway, so it can be kind of militant if you don't collaborate and learn what the needs are. So another thing that I did was develop the early feasibility study program with Dr. Andy Farb, and really focused on trying to identify least burdensome approaches for evaluating devices. So I talked about emphasizing communication, but providing education on device regulation is something that I've done. As Ben mentioned, I've done a lot of presentations, which you may not be able to tell because I'm so incredibly nervous talking to you all. But one of the things that I did do a lot was work with sponsor investigators like Dr. Starnes and Dr. Sweet to try to figure out how we can get these things moving. How can we allow you to study the devices and come up with better treatment options? In the beginning, I did a couple of workshops on preclinical testing of endovascular grafts, and that led to the Greenberg Stent Summits, where I worked with Dr. Roy Greenberg and now Matt Eagleton. And we did make a lot of progress in getting clinicians and industry engineers to communicate but there hasn't been a lot of emphasis on clinical trials, and I really want to focus on clinical trials today. I also led the development of international voluntary standards for several different devices, and that really helped with communication and understanding industry perspectives, but again, not a lot of emphasis on clinical studies. So I'm just going to get to the punchline. What's my opinion with respect to when you read information about clinical studies that have been done in order to satisfy FDA requirements? What are they good for? Well, it certainly allows for approval of treatment options. That's really what they're designed to do. They can be good at identifying fatal flaws or the need for redesign, provide insights into the benefits and risks of the devices when they're used in accordance with the IFU. And that's really important too. When you're trying to interpret the information, know that it only applies if you're within the IFU, and provide information to guide individual patient care. But it's like, there's never going to be a study that's going to tell you how to take care of an individual patient, of course. And so it just gives you some insights for this is what it looked like for this population, but you have to figure out how to apply that to your individual patients. Limitations, again, it's not going to be able to tell you exactly what to do, but I think it can be really hard to interpret the studies done to meet regulatory requirements in comparison to what you hear in the literature and what you talk about amongst your colleagues who have the expertise, because it's just a very different setup when you're trying to answer those regulatory questions. And please know that you can never do head-to-head comparisons between studies. Even if they're contemporary studies done at the same time, there's different definitions. It just isn't appropriate to look at the outcomes and think you can figure out which device is better, for example. So some of the things we've learned in the pre-market clinical studies, even before we had the marketing applications, that and I should have started out by saying I speak almost exclusively about endovascular grafts because that's where I have the most experience. And we had a number of devices that had significant issues. We had fractures associated with asymmetric deployment. We had seam disruptions in graft holes, limb occlusions, thromboembolic events, migration. Those failures all resulted in the devices never making it to a marketing application. So there's been a pretty good number that they did a clinical study where they were paying enough attention, found these problems so that we could get rid of them. They just weren't good designs. And Vanguard's a good example for those who are old enough to remember. That was marketed in outside the United States, but it was in our clinical study in the States where they found out that it was falling apart. So you really have to, look at the new devices closely and figure out what's going on. And that was kind of a success in terms of looking at the regulatory program in the US. And there were also a number of devices that had to be redesigned. So we had barb and hook fractures. And what they would do was try to figure out, can we just include some redundancy? Can we put in more barbs and hooks? And we changed the angle of the hook and barb. We also had some stent fractures. So there are things that have been learned that are really valuable to figure out device performance. And when we learn these things, like say, they can result in changes during the clinical study, but after you get into, the marketing application, FDA has a number of things that they try to do, and one of them is to give you information that you need in order to make decisions. That's one of their goals. They don't do a very good job, though, again, of explaining the limitations of what that information is. But it's important to note that they don't regulate practice in medicine. So FDA, there's a nice piece of the law that I could have put up on the screen, but didn't want to bore you with that sort of thing. I'd rather bore you with babbling. And they don't establish the standard of care. So when you think about FDA approvals, you think about them trying to give you treatment options, not to figure out the very best thing. But there definitely is a huge emphasis on developing the appropriate clinical trials. So everyone's not familiar with the terminology necessarily that FDA uses. And you always hear about devices being approved, and it doesn't matter which kind of approval it goes through or which type of marketing application. But there are two different ways to get to market. And the most common way is through the 510K program. And through that program, in order to show that your device is reasonably safe and effective, you demonstrate substantial equivalence to a legally marketed predicate device. So that means for their class 2 devices, so you have to find a device that is close enough to be like yours. We can say, we did testing, we show we have the same performance, and then you can go to market, but that's called cleared. So a 510K device is cleared, and it makes a difference in terms of when someone says it's approved, that means they went through a much more rigorous evaluation where you have to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness through testing and usually clinical studies. So sometimes you have clinical studies and 510Ks, but you almost always have them with PMAs. And it's important to note too that once you're in the PMA route with a particular device type, that's where you are. You can't say, okay, now there's one out there. I want to use that as a predicate for so I can go 510K. That's not allowed. You're stuck in the PMA world. So with the PMA approval, the goal is to describe how the benefits of using the device outweigh the risks. It's always a benefit risk sort of assessment. You have to talk about how the data support that a significant portion of the patient population will achieve clinically significant results, which is an interesting concept as we get into talking about the studies. Somehow you have to show that even though we did this limited study with highly selected patients, that once it's out into the real world, the majority of the population, or at least a significant portion, will have benefit. And then, as I mentioned, there's the goal of providing relevant information to clinicians to help with their clinical decisions for individual patients. There are 2 tools that FDA uses to communicate with you, and it would be really nice. And, I know some of you are a little early in your careers, so there might still be hope that you'll read the IFU and the SSED. So the IFU, the instructions for use, I know that people pay attention to it sometimes to try to figure out how to use the device, but there's other information in there that really is important when you're trying to figure out whether you should use the device for a particular patient. So you want to, of course, pay attention to the indications for use and the contraindications, but FDA also puts a lot of time into looking at the warnings and precautions to, again, let you know the limitations of the device, and a lot of that is based on what they learned in their clinical studies. The summary of the clinical studies is often in the IFU, and that gives you a little bit shorter version than what's in that other summary that I'll talk about in a minute. But the patient selection and treatment recommendations is where you can understand that's the only thing FDA knows about, and when they're giving their approval or doing the clearance, it's limited to that group. And they're trying to tell you that if you choose that group to treat, then you can expect your outcomes to be reasonably similar to what we had in the clinical study. So again, the important thing about the IFU, it really does reflect the indications for use, and it's very specific to that indication when it's giving you some help in figuring out whether your device is right for your individual patients. The summary of safety and effectiveness data is a much more extensive document than the IFU and really goes into detail with respect to like the clinical study. So you're going to know not just what the selection criteria, what the endpoints were, but there's going to give some insights, if it's a good summary, into how those were selected, why it was done that way. And so again, just if you don't look at anything else in a summary, look at that clinical thing, because you're going to see the same study reported in the literature, but they're not going to give you those insights. There's just not room in a manuscript. So read the SSEDs, at least for the first couple of years that you're working on these things, and try to figure out exactly what you're hearing when people are doing presentations about their studies, and also when you're looking at the label. So the PMA clinical data requirements, it really is to adequately define, you have to have an adequately defined, conducted, and monitored study, and it has to provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. The level of evidence depends on the intended use, alternative treatment options, and whether the device is new or next generation device. So as an example, with the Navion that you may have heard about, it's right now having some issues. It's been pulled from the market. That was the next generation device. So they did a much smaller clinical study, less follow-up, didn't do the usual 5-year follow-up that you would have with a new device, and then found out that there were some challenges because the assumptions they made with that device weren't appropriate. No one could have known, but that's why we need to do clinical studies and continue to get information on these devices. The selection of endpoints. So when we're talking about clinical studies, how does it work when you're trying to do a study of a new device? The sponsor, the manufacturer, comes in and says to FDA, this is what we think the right study is. And so they usually do that in consultation with clinical advisory board or clinical investigators. The challenge is those advisory folks and the clinicians may not totally understand what FDA would be looking for. And so they're looking at more from the approach of, if I were to use this device, what would I want to know about it? What are the clinical perspectives? And that obviously is helpful, but you have to go beyond that. You have to figure out how you can come up with a study that is doable, that can support your marketing application. And I can't remember if it was 10 years ago now. It used to be that if someone came in and their proposal didn't make any sense in terms of being able to support a marketing application, then FDA would not approve the IDE. But that's not how it works anymore. The manufacturer said that's not fair. So what happens is FDA can say, okay, you can go ahead and start your study, but they have all these concerns that no one ever hears about. They're in kind of a attachment to the letter. So people go in and say, well, FDA approved our study. Well, FDA approved the IDE, not necessarily the study, and there can be some significant problems with the study from FDA's perspective in terms of whether or not it'll support a marketing application. Often the studies are based on precedent, so you look at what's been done to evaluate similar devices. But for a new technology, it can be really kind of challenging to figure out what the appropriate endpoints can be. And so often what they end up doing is looking at the standard of care and trying to come up with endpoints that you can come up with the appropriate bar for meeting the endpoint based on the literature. And it's whether or not that really is relevant for the new type of device. So for example, with the endografts, we started obviously comparing to open surgical repair, but there are things that are more important with an endograft that don't apply to an open repair. So trying to figure out where do you set as long as we're this good, it's reasonable to get to market. So there are some difficulties in trying to come up with the best designs. But beyond just coming up with the right endpoints, there are other aspects that are really different with a FDA required study. I like the way the bar is floating around. So when you're designing a clinical study to support a marketing application, obviously it's focused on device evaluation. So you have to have data to evaluate primary and secondary endpoints. But as I mentioned, it really has to be a nice, clean, well-run study. So if you have unnecessary fields, if your case report form is bulky, you're probably going to end up with more protocol deviations. It costs money for every endpoint, for every piece of information that you capture. And you can end up in a situation where you got a lot of information and you don't know what to do about it. It's difficult to interpret. So those things really should be evaluated and assessed in studies outside of an FDA study. And in contrast, the literature can be focused on more specific things like strokes. And so we're working on this ARC definitions and talking to the stroke folks, and they're like, we got to go into the minutia with respect to evaluating strokes. And that makes total sense if it's a study specifically for that, and if it's a device specifically to address strokes. But when you're talking about something like an arch endograft, you don't want to go too deep because, again, what are you going to do with all that information, and does it really impact your decision to approve or not approve a device? So sometimes the deep dive is better off in separate studies. So if you're ever trying to help someone develop a clinical study to support a marketing application, You really want to help with designing it, thinking about the need to know in terms of an approval versus you want to know because you're clinicians and you really want to understand everything. So if we look at the clinical studies conducted for regulatory purposes, here's just some things to think about. That the patients are really highly selected. They're on-label patients. And the benefit to that is you can actually run the study, you have a good population that you can do your analyses. Limitations, clearly they're not representative of the intended patient population. There are strict endpoints directed at device evaluation, and you need that in order to get the information to evaluate device performance. But clinicians are often more interested in clinical outcomes. When endpoints are based on the standard of care, you get the appropriate comparison in performance goals, but they may not address the potential failure modes for study devices. Composite endpoints drive a reasonable sample size, but it's inconsistent with the definitions in the literature. It often is not really clinically meaningful. Generally, 1 year or less follow-up is needed to support a marketing application so that there's timely completion of the study, but then there's limited longer-term data to aid in clinical decision-making. So I've always said, I've always believed that we need more than just the study that supports the marketing application. We need additional follow-up, we need additional reporting, which you have some of in the literature, but it often is not focused on device performance. So we need to come up with a way to continue to get information. So if this is just my opinion. When I look at regulatory studies as compared to those kind of driven by the clinicians, from a regulatory perspective, it really has to do with focusing on those regulatory decisions, obviously, and looking at device performance, potential failure modes of a study device. Clinicians need the information to drive clinical decisions, obviously, and trying to figure out the best treatment option for their patients. And it would be nice if those were a little more connected, but often they're disparate. So when we think about differences in definitions and what's used in the clinical studies to support marketing applications compared to clinicians, I just have a couple examples. Like when we talk about technical success for an endovascular graft, you have to really focus on things like accurate delivery. And if you have to do additional maneuvers in order for everything to come out well, that's not considered a technical success. The reason behind that is we think that I still say we, I was at FDA for so long. The thought process is with FDA is that you need to understand what to expect when you use this device. So it's really focused on device performance. And if the device jumps when it's released from the delivery system, you need to be prepared for that. Whether or not you can, whether there's clinical sequelae associated with it and whether there's something that you can do to address the fact that that happened really isn't as important as knowing that it could happen. So the definitions are pretty strict. But when you look at what the clinicians usually use, and there'll be studies where they'll say, well, the investigator said it was a technical success because ultimately the lesion was excluded. So they don't care if they had to put 5 extra devices in because they just want to make sure that ultimately the patient is taken care of. And as another example, you can see that people will say there's assisted and secondary technical success. And they don't always give a really great definition of it, but it can be, again, just saying, in the end, is the patient okay? Did they get their lesion taken care of? And that's a very different way of looking at it compared to what the FDA is concerned about. So we have to decide whether we need to do either or both when we're talking about clinical studies for FDA, because right now it's really focused just on what FDA needs and what they believe, and they don't necessarily give you what you might want to hear about. Another example with differences in definitions and how it can affect your interpretation of the information. For strokes, you can include all strokes, which is what was done early on, or just disabling stroke, and you need to know what's included. With respect to interventions, sometimes all interventions are included, but there are situations, especially with the branch devices, where you exclude implantation of a covered stent to provide adequate coverage of a lesion. Why should that count against the technology? I'm not saying that it should, but you have to know whether it is included or not. And then it's often that there would be a proposal to not have to include as a failure that you put in a covered stent if you had an iatrogenic dissection. And to FDA, but you are causing a problem that you have to fix. So that really should count against. And if you talk to some of the leaders in the vascular world, they'll say, it's just no big deal. There's no reason to include that as a negative. And when we talked about that there are composite endpoints, how do you include that at the same level as something much more significant? So it really can be a bit of a challenge. And another example of that you have to understand is lesion-related mortality, whether you're including all deaths within 30 days in the index procedure, or sometimes they exclude suicide and accidental death. Probably doesn't change the numbers a lot, but you need to understand what the definitions are. Other things we have to think about are the patient selection and study design. So some studies, life expectancy for the population included is 1 year. Other times it's 2 years. And that obviously can make a big difference in terms of the patient comorbidities and paying attention to those sorts of things. And then it gets complicated with respect to lesion types and landing zones. And we talked a little bit about some of this yesterday, where you did a nice job of presenting, what happens when you're landing in a prior EVAR. Well, when you do a clinical study to satisfy FDA, is that a separate study arm? Can you combine it? What's the right way to do it? But at the very least, can you at least explain what you did and why it's the right thing? So those are all sorts of things that we have to think about. So the impact of the different definitions, it can be really difficult to interpret results. I've been digging through a lot of the literature lately, trying to help come up with performance goals, come up with how we should bucket the different patients. Do we include all the different lesion types together? Do we include the landing zones that are different together? And you just can't tease it out when you're looking at the literature. When you look at across studies, there can be some wrong assumptions with respect to thinking, again, that device is better than that device for a particular population, because you don't know what the definitions are. So it's really not appropriate to do those comparisons. There can be some confusion when you have presentations and literature based on the same studies that were included in the labeling, because again, the clinicians might say this is 100% success, whereas when you look at what FDA says, there's a 89% technical success rate. So it's not probably life-altering, but it's confusing. And then it's difficult to establish appropriate expectations for success for the clinical studies, because you just don't have all the information that you need. So some solutions, we can develop and apply consistent definitions across studies as much as possible. Again, we're working with the R chart to try to get some of that done. Really important to understand the limitations of a study. And for example, randomization doesn't solve all. And that's something that came up recently. There's an endovascular graft company that actually has done a randomized study, and they say, but it's randomized. And they think because it's randomized, they've taken care of all these problems that I've talked about. It just doesn't work that way. There are still rules with respect to clinical studies, and just don't believe that randomization, it means you should believe that study more than others. You have to look at all the details for those also. We need prospectively defined studies, even when you're doing retrospective enrollment, because that provides the most reliable evidence. So when you're looking at doing some research and you have a nice body of data like you have here, figure out what you're going to do with that data before you actually do it, because then it will be a valid assessment. And consider study conduct as well as the design. You have to make sure you do it right. It doesn't matter if you just come up with something that looks good in the first place. But maybe the most important thing, I guess, is what I'm trying to say is that you really need to learn regulatory speak if you're involved in pre-market clinical studies. You need to figure out how you can help develop something that is rational from a clinical standpoint, but meets all those needs from the regulatory perspective. So the good news is you are already working on a lot of those things here. And what I would just like to ask you to do is to share those insights. And so when you do your publications, make sure that there's enough information to help FDA and the folks who are trying to design these studies take advantage of things that you've learned. And we heard some great things yesterday about making sure that we have definitions so that you can provide meaningful insights into what you're looking at. We really need to identify who to treat and how urgently. That was part of the discussion yesterday. And Dr. Sweet talking about frailty. We need to make sure that that's communicated and people consider that. And we need to think about genetics. Again, we talked about yesterday. The visceral segment dilating after VVAR, that's something that should be addressed and thought about in terms of success. Are we going to count that against the device when it happens, no matter what type of device is in there, or just be prepared to address it in some respect? Technical success in prior EVAR is achievable. Well, if you can help FDA understand, it really doesn't matter if there's a prior repair there. You can put that into one study arm. That's really going to increase enrollment. It's going to mean that you can get your study done sooner. And it's also more realistic in terms of how the devices are going to be used. We heard that explant of prior repairs is difficult. And so when you're thinking about device design, not just the study, trying to come up with technologies that don't eliminate options is really an important perspective. And then the IDE teams are the key to success. And that is so important to make sure that, again, it's not just designing the study, but making sure that you run it well. So I appreciate that you're taking care of my problems here. I just need you to make sure that FDA hears about all the great things that you're doing. So that just gets me to, again, what is one way to really help out and accomplish things that we need? And that's these sponsor investigator studies like Dr. Sweet and Dr. Starnes have. And what it really is responsible innovation. So there are a lot of folks that are out there doing the PMEGs, doing the different things, snorkels, chimneys, what have you, that they don't have IDEs. And it's just not the right way to go about it. They're adopting approaches without having good evaluations. So those sponsor investigator studies are really good for that, but it's not just that. It really helps because it's good data to refine the patient selection, procedures, post-procedure management, and device designs. The sponsor investigator data can be incredibly helpful in designing manufacturer-sponsored studies and identify potential limitations and disprove assumptions. And as an example, just looking at the landing in a prior EVAR. If it's not an issue, why do we have to have it separate? And the other thing is, of course, you can provide treatment options to your patients. So FDA doesn't necessarily want to admit that, but these sponsor investigator IDEs are life-saving for a lot of patients. The limitations, it's kind of tough to say just because Ben can do it, everybody else can, but at least he's training a bunch of you too. They may not be powered to test hypotheses, they actually rarely are. So they're not prospectively defined adequately to test hypotheses. And the patient selection is often restricted because of the lack of data to support a broader population under the IDE. But once you get more experience, and we talked about this yesterday, you can go to FDA and ask that they expand the population that you can treat. So that's all I have for you. I appreciate your patience with my nerves and my mask. And, I know that this is a very different rounds than what you're used to, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about FDA, of course, even beyond the topic that we had here today.
That's fantastic, Dorothy. You answered most of I was writing down questions while you were talking, and you answered almost all of them. I guess a broader question is, with the success of the vaccines and the vaccine development within the FDA, my experience with the FDA has been that they're incredibly communicative. it's very easy to contact someone at the FDA and to discuss an issue you may be having with a trial. How is the FDA adapting to the modern world? What positive developments have you seen in the last 3 decades for device approval and pathways to device success? You know, we have this 30-day rule, we have the 5-day rule, we have all these rules that help us get a device to market quicker. Give us your broad perspectives on the FDA as an organization.
So first off, it's important to remember that FDA is broken down in different bits, you know. So the people that are dealing with the vaccines, they did pull in obviously other folks to help when they had all this going on during the pandemic, but there obviously is a huge emphasis on public health. That's what the job is. And I can only really speak toward device evaluation, but what they have done there is they've really tried to develop programs like the breakthrough designation for devices that are truly addressing unmet needs. They have the safer devices program. So they're providing more tools to improve the communication with FDA. And it's interesting you say you've always been able to pick up the phone. Well, you're working with a group that really believes it's appropriate to work collaboratively, especially with the surgeons and the users of these devices. It's not always the case. It's a little bit more difficult sometimes to have those conversations. And so they've put guidances in place that really push the FDA people to have the communication that we've done. So I've seen over the years, there are a lot of things that we did in our group that they've put into guidances. You know, like the early feasibility study program, we've always functioned that way, that part of the goal of that is to get into the clinic at the right time. You don't have to do every single type of non-clinical testing that you will ultimately have to do on a device before you get into the clinic. So right testing at the right time, you need to see if it's feasible, you know, when you have something really innovative. So you get into the clinic, you refine the device, you do what you need to do, then you do that extensive non-clinical testing that's very expensive and really only appropriate when you have a more final device design. So those are the sorts of things that FDA is trying to do. And again, mandating that you do communicate better. I think the other thing that is happening is they're very proactive in dealing with the COVID. And again, they put out, I don't know, 15 different guidances as that was happening to say, talk to us, let us know what's going on, let us know if we need to change the study in any way. They've given a lot of good guidance on what to do with patients who had COVID previously and, you know, how to address it in your selection criteria. And, you know, just talk to FDA if you're having trouble getting your follow-up. It doesn't mean that your study is going to have to be thrown out because you had the challenges during that time.
Yeah.
So they're trying to communicate better.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Doug Wood.
Dr. Wood, I think you're on mute.
No,
you're on.
Sorry.
No,
We're
I'm
getting the
not.
experts.
1 minute.
Are you guys able to hear me in the room?
Okay. Dr. Wood?
Yeah, are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, great. So Ms. Abel, thank you so much for helping us see under the hood. I mean, I know Ben is very familiar with this, with all the work that he's been doing for decades, but I think what you've been talking to us about is a kind of a black box for many of the surgeons who aren't used to working with the FDA or working with industry. But opportunities to work with industry is actually really important for particularly surgical investigators. Are there, you know, do you have a summary of kind of tips for residents or junior faculty who are potentially exploring a research relationship with industry, of how to enter that successfully and how to be a good partner with industry, and then subsequently good partner with the FDA?
Well, that's a great question. And I wish I had a really nice answer to it other than to say, take every opportunity you get to learn about what industry is up against in terms of, the regulatory processes. And if they're, when you're bored, take some classes, become a clinical trialist. I mean, anything that you can do. But I just, for me, networking is such a huge thing. And make sure you talk to everyone you can when you're at the meetings. Don't just hang out with your kind. Branch out, talk to some of the industry folks. Obviously publishing is really important. Great question. When next time we're all together at a meeting, I'll introduce you to the people that, you can start having those conversations with. And I think probably be a good question for folks that have kind of already made that bridge a little bit, like Dr. Sweet might be a really good person to hear his perspectives on things that you should do. And I actually want him to get more involved because he gets it. And it's just not every clinician that has the perspectives that he has. So I'm punting to Dr. Sweet. But at least you have the expertise here.
Thanks, Dorothy. This is Matt Sweet. I don't know that there's any, I don't know what else I could add other than I think a big part of it has just been engagement and having an open ear to what, as you said, sort of what does the FDA need and what do the industry partners need? And I think so much of it is just kind of listening to what they're trying to accomplish and adding our perspective to it. So I don't have a good answer to that question. I think it's a great question. It's been a really satisfying part of my own career thus far. And I certainly, if there's, honestly, it might, mentorship helps a lot. And so Mark Fillinger was my mentor in fellowship, who was very engaged in device development for many years. And just hearing his sort of discussion and thought process about a lot of this really guided how I approached it. So to the residents and students and junior faculty out there, I think that this is an opportunity where mentorship can be just super, super helpful, both in terms of establishing those connections and relationships, and also just helping to understand some of the nuance of what each specialty, endovascular devices are looking for one sort of, or not one thing, but for one battery of things. And I think other surgical subdisciplines are looking for others, but that's where the mentorship can really help.
Thank goodness you have that here.
I think I don't see any other questions in the chat box. That was fantastic. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you for your presentation this morning.
Well, thank you again for your patience.